Thanks for that lovely warm introduction, Dirk. Um, so uh, basically the topic of my talk, the topic of a lot of the work that my lab does is syntax in bilingual aphasia populations. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, syntactic processing in bilingual aphasia. So it's very niche, right? I was talking to one of my coworkers a couple weeks ago about this talk, and this is the first response that I get from a lot of people about this topic. And of course, I'm biased, but I'm going to argue with you to start off that this is not really that niche of a topic. So if you work with aphasia populations, likely they're going to have grammar deficits, but also very, very likely you will work with bilingual populations. So is grammar important, or is syntax important, meaningful for people with aphasia for communication? Well, the aim of rehabilitation generally in aphasia is to improve everyday communication as one of the holistic aspects. And we generally don't assume that grammar is really that important of a part, but I think that it is, right? So when we have English, which is where most of our data is coming from, when people have aphasia, they reduce functional elements, so they reduce sentential structure. But their sentences have generally intact word order, and as a result, those intact word order sentences being canonical aid in communication. So English speakers, even with reduced grammar structure, they're still using the surface level grammar for most people, and we can understand what they're trying to communicate. But this is not necessarily true across human languages. And as I mentioned, since most of our data is coming from English speakers, we want to understand, of course, what might be impacted across other human languages. So syntactic elements that we might want to consider, sentence level things, constituent word order. So we have English. This is an SVO language, so it's subject, verb, object. We're familiar with this. Morphosyntactic richness. So a lot of us are going to be familiar with the agreement, past tense, third person singular, those kinds of things. English doesn't have a lot of these kinds of morphosyntactic elements, these grammatical markers. So it's an analytic language. And finally, at the kind of most granular level, even morphemes, lexical morphemes, words have their own syntax. So we're all familiar with parts of speech, but there's even subcategories. So for example, in English, nouns could be divided into count and non-count nouns, and this is a syntactic category rather than a semantic one. So if we take that information and we look across other languages, we can see an example sentence here. I made a hole in it, and you can see the syntactic loss underneath, and as well some of the information I've just described about English. In particular, it's a rigid word order language, so we're generally not moving the pieces of our sentence around when we're speaking English. Although, if somebody sounds like yoga, we're going to understand them. Now, I picked that sentence in particular because I have a translation of it into Salish. Salish is a language spoken very close to University of Montana. In fact, we're on the traditional lands of the Salish people. And you can see that that sentence is also one word. So Salish at its core is considered to be a VSO language, verb, subject, object, but it also has a very flexible word order. And as I pointed out already, it's polysynthetic, meaning that we're gluing all of the pieces together in our sentence so that we have very few words. Here we're having only one word. Some interpretations would consider Salish to be nounless, meaning that nouns and verbs are not syntactically differentiated in the language. Let's go with a sentence in a language that many of us are going to be familiar with, also the second most commonly spoken language in the United States. So here we have Spanish. So another translation of the same sentence we can see on the right there with our gloss. On its surface, Spanish appears to be really similar to English. It's also an SVO language, but it also has a flexible word order, which means that we can move those pieces around more often. In fact, in this example sentence, we have an obligatory movement of one of our object pronouns to the front of the sentence. There's also a lot more of those little pieces of grammar in the sentence. So unlike English, Spanish is considered a synthetic language. So taking these things together, what are we doing when we're trying to produce a sentence, right? So first, we're going to start with an idea, such as we're seeing an adorable baby dog just existing there. I'm a little, I like cute things. So I like cute things. I might say, the puppy is cute. A sentence you might hear me say a lot. So at the end, we're going to have articulation. So what happens in the middle here, some kind of black box of syntax. And if you watched Jeremy Yaton's C-Star lecture a couple of months ago, this will look very familiar. So I'm cheating a little bit there, pulling from our joint work. So there's a number of theoretical accounts to describe what's kind of going on in the middle there. And across these theoretical accounts, there's a convergence on a central tenet that there's two streams of processing. And so you can see across the different models there in de Buck and Levelt, it's functional versus positional processing. The Fubera and Slovek, it's content versus structural processing. Match and Hickok, hierarchical versus linear processing. Kraska and Lau, representation versus linearization. So what is happening kind of on one side versus the other of the processing of these elements? Representation, we think generally involves lexical morpheme selection and processing, what we might call words, maybe other kinds of morphemes, hierarchical operations, and functional assignment, whereas linearization includes constituent assembly, inflectional morphosyntax selection, possibly, although there's a good deal of debate going on right now about whether the selection of different kinds of morphemes happens at different points, and of course, linear ordering. So we can see that folks have different kinds of errors when they have aphasia. So these may correspond to an interruption at different points in that process. And we kind of correlate these to the categories, the syndromes of aphasia. So first we have paragrammatism, and we theoretically relate this to errors in the representation, and what we would observe in folks' behavior if they have those types of processing errors is a miss or an overuse of functional morphemes. And then on the other hand, if folks are having an interruption or errors in linearization, this might appear as missing functional morphemes or word order violations, and we might call this expressive agrammatism. There is a lot of disagreement about either of these syndromes, what terms we should use, where the barrier lies. I'm not trying to get too deeply into that. I'm just trying to illustrate what the flavors of errors might be when we come to our bilingual aphasia. And of course, this is not the only way that someone with aphasia can have a violation. Folks also, or errors, Folks can also have difficulties in processing grammatical information during comprehension, and we might call that receptive agrammatism, but I'm not going to give that a lot of attention today. So I know everybody likes examples. What does this look like in English? So if we start with paragrammatism in English, we might see some example sentences. These ones actually are pulled from Magin et al., as well as a further work that we're doing in collaboration. And the first example, you can see she got the flied. The word fly is being used as both a noun and a verb in this context. And in the second example, we see what has been termed a sentence monster. And essentially, we have hierarchical structures just kind of being glued together. So it's not necessarily a problem of linearization. There is structure, but there's not really a rhyme or reason to how it's being put together. And of course, the traditional syndrome that we're most familiar with, agrammatism, we can see in our first example there, really telegraphic speech. It's got not a lot of structure, simplified sentences, missing morphosyntax. But I also want to point out that a reduction does not mean necessarily a complete loss of morphosyntactic elements. So if we look at other languages, first off, paragrammatism is not a term that is used widely outside of English. So I have it starred here because Medigard et al. Did not consider this example to be paragrammatic. We may or may not analyze it like this, but what this example shows is that rather than a reduction of elements, there is the selection of an incorrect element for the sentence context. And in another example in French, we can see what is kind of traditionally our sentence monster. Children each did the other their work. And my French is terrible, so I'm not gonna try to butcher the pronunciation there. Now, we often are going to see the agrammatism across languages with some reductions, and you can see that in the first example, also from Medigard et al., West Greenlandic. So there's a missing morphosyntactic element. If we go to our French, we can see our traditional telegraphic example. But just like in the English, not only do we still have some of our morphosyntax, we're still seeing, in fact, the spreading activation of the plural S across the noun phrase. So having correct agreement. Okay, so putting all of that together, grammars differ widely across the 7,000 plus languages that we've documented. So it should be clear that if somebody speaks another language, their grammar system might be fairly different across the hundreds of different features that we might analyze. And why it's particularly important, for one, we're probably going to interact with people that are bilingual. So for example, Dirk, the person that has introduced me today, is a bilingual. He speaks Dutch and English, among other languages. So estimates put over half of worldwide speakers at being bilingual. But of course, this really depends on your definition of bilingual. So a traditional definition that we might be familiar with in the bilingualism literature even is the daily use of more than one language. But for clinical populations, we want to focus on the pattern of acquisition. And I will point out why, but first I want to give us an example here.
So how old were you when you learned English?
Ero credo sia 24, 25.
20?
for 24, 25.
Yeah, about that time. And you came to live here? Okay. And after that, it was all English speaking?
Sempre inglese. Sono andata a scuola di inglese.
So what happened?
Ho imparato tutto l'inglese.
So rather than playing that whole clip there, I just want to point out that our patient being spoken to in English, responding in Italian. She was asked about her language history. She said 24, 25, 24, 25. That's when she moved to the UK and began exclusively using English. So according to a lot of definitions of bilingualism, she wasn't functionally a bilingual. She was using exclusively English until she had her stroke. So why would this happen? Well, there's some kind of ground truths, ground beliefs about bilingualism that we want to consider. So first, we believe that the same parts of the brain support processing of all languages. And here you can see a visualization of how that might be modeled. So although it's often repeated that different parts of the brain do language A or B, or you start learning a second language in your right hemisphere, this is not necessarily coming from a lot of robust research. In addition, prior research has consistently suggested that all languages start in the on position, and that the non-target language actually has to be suppressed. So inhibitory processing. This might relate to a unique advantage that bilinguals have in executive control, which might be because they have to have this very strong language control. Now, whether their unique abilities are actually that unique, or whether they relate to language control is a matter of debate. But nevertheless, we do see that bilinguals need to suppress the non-target language. And we can see the different areas related to executive control also tend to be found supporting language control. So together, those unique abilities might positively affect bilinguals' cognitive reserve. And this we're probably aware of, we've probably heard in the news that bilinguals are diagnosed on average about 7 years later with dementia, PPA. Does it prohibit this? Does it actually prevent somebody having dementia? No, that's not really what the literature is suggesting. It's just been found that they're diagnosed later. So there's definitely some kind of cognitive benefit to bilingualism. But even more so, there might be a relationship not just for dementia, but for post-stroke outcomes. Now, this research is very new. There's not a lot of it, but there are some examples that suggest this. So I hope at this point we're thinking, yes, I need to consider bilingualism if I have a bilingual aphasia patient. So how do we consider their bilingualism? For one, you might have heard the oft-quoted passage from Grosjean that a bilingual is not two monolinguals in one. So essentially, bilinguals have a unique grammar system. Their grammars are interacting and affecting one another. And so because there's this interaction, the more similar a word or grammatical structure is, the faster and more accurately it's processed, as well as being acquired. And here you can see kind of a representation from Kroll and Stewart, why that might be. So we believe that some things might even have a shared representation, such as the meaning of a cognate. And a cognate is a word that has a shared meaning, and very similar or even the same form representation across languages. So based on the typological differences of the languages that someone speaks, for monolinguals, folks have been found to attune to different types of information, and that attention to different syntactic information interacts and affects what's happening with bilingual speakers. So English speakers, for example, attune more to word order, whereas Spanish speakers generally attune more to morphosyntactic information. So what we find for a bilingual speaker is they might be, if they're a Spanish and English bilingual, tending to both of these information to more or less equivalently, or at least somewhere in between. But putting what we know about bilingualism together, there's not just an effect of first language and second language typology. We also need to consider bilingual background factors. But before I get to explaining the bilingual background factors, I also want to point out that we see bilingual processing happening in stages. Folks are attending generally to the least complex, most similar information first in the acquisition process, and later they're acquiring more complex structures. The structures acquired later, the most complex structures, are also the ones that people with aphasia are having difficulty with. In fact, there's overlaps that might not be very obvious to us. So later learned structures for people learning English include third person singular S and copula B, which we've already seen in the examples that I've presented, are potentially vulnerable for English speakers. So, bilingual background. We know that not all bilinguals are alike. What is important? What do we find very consistently in the literature? Well, age of acquisition can affect our bilinguals processing. So we kind of have three flavors that we might distinguish. So simultaneous bilinguals, people who are acquiring two languages from birth. We distinguish from sequential bilinguals, people who are acquiring their second language at some point later in their life. We can also potentially distinguish childhood sequential bilingualism versus adult bilingualism. We see differences in folks based on their levels of proficiency, but also with a caveat here, because proficiency is not a static property. It changes over someone's lifetime. So as I mentioned about my French, I used to be pretty okay at French, but I haven't used it much recently. Acquisition, of course, can happen in a variety of environments. This should come as no surprise to us, but it might affect things even like syntax, because someone will be getting potentially different kinds of inputs. Related to that, someone's usage can vary across the domains of their life, so that they're using and the relative frequency of words and structures increase as they relate to their different domains. And finally, kind of putting that together, some folks use and are proficient in their languages more or less equally, so these are balanced bilinguals, but most people kind of have some imbalance between their languages. So putting these factors together, the bilingual background factors, we might also call them individual difference factors, and we see them again and again across the literature affecting healthy bilingual processing. And it's not merely just bilingual identity or behavioral measures. We can also see these variety of factors affecting our neurophysiological measures. So how might this be represented in a model of second language acquisition or processing? How are the structural elements processed by the bilinguals? Well, as I've mentioned, there's not different parts of the brain doing a second language. So we want to have a model with the same mechanisms as monolinguals, based on the fact that we see behavioral performance of bilinguals often as an intermediary between monolinguals' performance. We might believe that our two grammars are existing as a gradient rather than a binary in our system. And we want to have a model, a representation with the same basic representations across languages, as long as the representations are not contradicting one another. So in work currently being developed with Alex Krauska for how this might work, we want a model that is going to represent all of the facts that we've gathered from the empirical data for healthy bilingual speakers, but it needs to be a model that is adjustable for different bilingual identities or grammatical proficiencies. So to start off with, this is the model that we already saw at Krauska and Lau. In the beginning stage of second language acquisition, we're going to assume fully formed L1. Simultaneous bilingualism might be different, although with a lot of overlaps. I'm not going to deal with that really today. So in early second language exposure, we believe that language learners, LLs, memorize forms and patterns mapping onto their L1 forms. So there's not a lot of interpretation. So essentially, novel representations are just linking to current representations at the same level, piggybacking onto the L1 representations themselves. So this new grammar is not a unique syntax. It's just using the patterns of the L1. So if we take an example like Spanish, the language that I'm okay at, you might be familiar with the noun phrase where the adjective occurs after the noun and the opposite pattern of English. So it's not necessarily going to be a unique rule. If you're acquiring Spanish, you'll just have that as, okay, I start with my English linearization, and then I add one more final rule. I'm going to move my adjective. It's going to go in the opposite place. We also might see that besides something being really similar, something that is markedly different in the representation, a markedly different grammar structure, is sometimes easier than things with a partial overlap. And these structures might, at this point, get their own representation. But this can be very difficult, right? So learning a new language requires focusing on identifying the differences, using those heuristics to accommodate them. So overall, putting that together, second language acquisition at this point is quite effortful and uses a lot of conscious metalinguistic knowledge. And so there is language control being developed, but it's not particularly strong yet. So as the second language acquisition advances, the second language forms, they were initially piggybacking on the L1, and they're still sometimes piggybacking on the L1, but they're eventually separating into separate second language representations. So the second language forms relate to more unique syntactic objects in the second language now, on occasion. Elements that have more reliable one-to-one-to-one meaning syntax form mappings are going to be what's acquired first, while things that are more variable or rely on a larger piece of syntax or their mapping process will be acquired later. And we see at this point potentially that there's mappings between levels of representation rather than within the same level of representation. In addition, very much related to that point, with this improved between level representation, the second language would potentially have improved parsing and production strategies. So rather than relying completely on the first language parsing and production strategies. As someone begins to have stronger abilities in their second language, what they're going to be able to attune to is going to change over time. So what input is more perceptible is going to change. Putting all of that together again, we might then expect, and matching what we see in the data, that folks with stronger proficiency have stronger control mechanisms to accommodate their second language linearization patterns, as well as selectively facilitate or inhibit either language, right? So this is an English only context. I am inhibiting my Spanish. I'm doing that really well. If I had to switch to Spanish, I would probably have somewhat okay, but still fairly weak inhibition of my English. But because that ability is strengthening, it's also reinforcing my cognitive reserves. So at this point, folks with this level have reinforced cognitive reserves as well. Now, this is not necessarily the end stage, because we do see folks that are the most advanced, even people who start learning a second language in their lifetime during adulthood, becoming very, very native-like in both languages. We don't see this for most people. So most adult second language learners will plateau at this stage. Now, as I mentioned, that was not the last stage. So most, the folks that are the most advanced bilinguals will appear native-like in most structures, with of course some caveats. So we still might see differences in behavioral measures from monolinguals, particularly in implicit processing. We might see that features that they aren't able to attend to depend on their first language properties, and or they might undergeneralize syntactic features of the second language to fill in gaps in the second language using the first language. But for this advancement, we have one system and we're asking it to do a lot more complexity of syntax. And even though we can physically see often for bilinguals that they have greater gray matter density, wet matter connections, we still need information consolidation, right? It's still more or less a finite system. So this greatest amount of information consolidation might relate to folks at this level having the strongest language control and very strong cognitive reserves. Okay, so this model's a little bit unspecified. We're still developing it, and I am very eager to hear folks' thoughts and opinions about it in questions, but haven't quite gotten to grammar deficits, grammar processing, and bilingual aphasia. So of course, what does this say about syntactic processing and bilingual aphasia? What would we predict? Well, it's the same basic model, so we will expect for bilingual people with aphasia to have errors in either representation and or linearization, of course, relating to lesion location. But with an extra kind of layer of complexity. So we should expect that there's an interplay between the cross-linguistic similarity of the grammatical features of the two languages, as well as what point are they in those stages of acquisition. So I'm going to focus on the second to last stage because that's where we're going to see most people who are bilingual. So what would we expect kind of within the individual? We might expect that a bilingual person with aphasia will have parallel deficits or overlapping grammar structures if they have unimpaired language control, but non-parallel deficits on these structures if they have impaired language control, right? So inability to equivalently access or process similar structures. Now, this is a really interesting question for research and understanding bilingual processing. But if we are interested in clinical outcomes, clinical implications, what's really important is the comparison between bilingual people with aphasia and monolingual people with aphasia. Because in case we were unaware, most of our assessments are for monolingual people with aphasia, which I will point out a little bit more later. So bilingual people with aphasia will have fewer deficits on overlapping grammar structures compared to monolingual people with aphasia due to these reinforced cognitive reserves. So they have this so much stronger power compared to their monolingual peers, all things being equal according to their backgrounds, their aphasia characteristics, but greater deficits on partially overlapping structures, since these would be acquired later and with more difficulty. Now, of course, these are just predictions. Does this match what we see in the aphasia literature? Well, for one, we do see that those bilingual background factors, individual differences, just like they're affecting healthy bilingualism, we see effects in clinical populations such as bilingual aphasia. And you might be familiar with these old adages, Petra's law, Ribot's law, that you should expect recovery of the dominant language or recovery of the first language. But if we look at reviews, we find really mixed results. And I will get to why that is going to happen. In particular, we also see really mixed results with regard to these effects in treatment generalization. So folks in America generally treating English, are we seeing effects in the non-treated language? Well, as I mentioned, there's limited data, so we can't really conclusively say that either the dominant language or the first language are going to be the one that is recovered first, that it's going to have better results in aphasia. And in particular, we definitely really can't say this about syntactic processing in aphasia. And as we'll see, it's because there's no prior review of syntactic processing in bilingual aphasia. But bilingual background factors generally, we might understand they're more difficult to gather that information because a bilingual person with aphasia has a communication barrier. So they might not be able to communicate all of those factors, those bilingual background factors. The data on their bilingual background might be less valid. For one, a care partner might not be sharing quite accurate information about another individual's background. But moreover, we see inconsistent recording of bilingual background for bilingual patients. So we conducted in my lab, along with several collaborators, and here you can see my students that are leading in the project, a systematic review of 5 databases with publications that included bilingual people with aphasia, so not necessarily the target, and they merely mention grammatical processing or grammatical deficits. We addressed 3 research questions. I'm not going to talk about the third one. I just want to point out why there's 97 articles. Some of the articles did show up in more than one question, but essentially the first question here is, within an individual, do we see differences in grammar deficits or patterns between language A and B? And our second question here is, for bilingual people with aphasia, do we see equivalencies to monolingual people with aphasia? Of course, we also included some quality analysis of our articles under consideration. And here you can see the languages that are represented in this data. Again, English is showing up really significantly, and Spanish is the only language that was in more than 15 articles. I also want to point out here just very briefly about the quality of the data that we're getting from those 97 articles that have mentioned the grammar of a bilingual person with aphasia. 52 out of 97 were observational or case studies, and the vast majority of those case studies had a single individual. So let's look at the evidence. So within an individual, we do, of course, find kind of matching our expectations, some parallel deficits. For example, in a study of Greek-English bilinguals, it was found that nouns were easier to retrieve than verbs across both languages. Kind of conversely, but a similar pattern within an individual, an Arabic-French bilingual person with aphasia had easier retrieval of adjectives compared to nouns or verbs in either language. And of course, we find non-parallel deficits across languages. So in a study of Greek-English bilinguals, in fact, using the same participants as that original study, folks had an easier time spelling verbs than nouns, but only in Greek. Now, comparing across groups of patients, we again find some studies with parallel deficits. So in Persian, English, German, bilingual people with aphasia, compared to only Persian monolingual people with aphasia, there was omission of functional morphemes and simplified verbs in Persian, which was similar across patients. In Basque Spanish and Basque monolingual patients with aphasia, there was a similar lack of difference in reading semantically reversible sentences. And this was a particularly strong study, although they only included non-fluent patients. We also have seen studies with non-parallel deficits. We finally see studies with both parallel and non-parallel deficits. And this is kind of more of what we would expect, because thinking back to the beginning of this talk, the typological overlap, not all structures are similar. We wouldn't necessarily expect a parallel on quite everything. But we don't really find consistent patterns across the literature. So getting to some original data, what should we do next? What should we look at with more patients? Well, we should want to systematically examine affected and preserved grammar structures in bilingual people with aphasia, and very importantly, comparing to 2 groups of matched bilingual people with aphasia. And of course, it doesn't really hurt to compare to healthy bilinguals as controls, which has been done more often than not. We want to examine full, partial, and non-overlapping grammar structures, as well as gather detailed language histories. So we are just starting to do this in our overlapping grammar and aphasia research study. We have, for Spanish-English bilinguals, our 3 groups of controls. That data has not yet been analyzed. So we're going to not talk about super exciting results here. So across 5 tasks, I'm going to focus on one of our tasks, our scripted dialogue task. So in this task, it's basically a prime for our patient to complete a script. And in the script, it's the same structure with variable object pronoun and target verb conjugation. So here you can see exactly what it is in English. The man doesn't want to open the box, but the woman, and then our patient completes the sentence, wants to open it. And if you speak Spanish, you might already have a clue of what we're looking at. The second line goes, but I want to open the box. Participant says, open it. So this command, which in Spanish would be the subjunctive. So I'm going to focus my discussion on the object pronoun because this is the structure that the original study, Rossi 2013, examined in our partial replication. And you can see the comparison in the Spanish. The object clitic can be modified not just for number, but also must agree on the grammatical gender. And furthermore, it can vary in location, not so much in English. So we're going to focus a comparison in the Italian because we don't have the Spanish data to compare to. So focusing, as I mentioned, just on that object pronouns, we see that about half of folks' errors are just omission, with very infrequent errors substituting a different pronoun of gender or a number mismatch. And there you can see a visualization of those results. So over half of the trials were correct for our patients. There's more than one way to analyze this, so we gave folks as many attempts as they needed. So we, in this analysis, are showing the correct attempt and comparing it to the original Italian. Again, it's a slightly different sentence prime, but the same general concept. We see a lot more variability in the types of errors that Italian speakers were making. So why might this be? Well, it might reflect differences in the underlying representation of that structure between speakers of English and Italian. So the functional element itself might be different between these languages. On the other hand, it might just be differences in who we recruited so far. So our English patients here were participating in an intensive comprehensive aphasia program, and on average, they're on the more severe side. So how might we extrapolate this to what we could expect from our Spanish-English bilingual people with aphasia? Well, based on, we still need to get that Spanish monolingual data, but if it's replicated the Italian results in Spanish, meaning that there might be different representations, this might indicate that the structure underlyingly is different, then it might be weaker and more prone to errors, similar to the results, what we saw for the English patients. On the other hand, if it's due to differences in the characteristics of the participants in the study, we would probably then see differences by degree of similarity, with severe having more omissions, moderate severity having more variability in the types of errors, and mild bilingual patients being more accurate than monolingual patients. And as a final note, it's really important to look across different languages and different populations. And I as a final, very, very small caveat, our case study, I want to point to a pilot analysis for research going on with the Aphasia and South Asian Languages group. So we have a case study of a Hindi-English bilingual speaker. And what we can see here is from her discourse samples, analyzing to see what's going on similar, what are the differences between languages. We can see, for one, that there's a similar preservation of copula, actually, between English and Hindi. And why this might be, English and Hindi actually have similar copula structure. On the other hand, for longer sentences, we see, such as the decided elope or go prince to mute want, that these more complex structures, which are of course different between English and Hindi, are a little bit more susceptible to damage. Okay, so what are the key takeaways for researchers from this talk with this mostly predictions and not a lot of evidence? I will ask you to join me in studying bilingual patients. We just don't really have enough data. More work needs to be done. If you have a bilingual patient, if you have a bilingual participant, gather detailed language background because it is relevant to understanding their behavioral pattern, and finally assess them in all languages. And before I end, I just want to point out, if you're like, what assessments across languages? We have a systematic review that my student has conducted of assessments across languages, and as well we indicate whether they've been normed bilingually or monolingually. So I just want to thank everyone who has contributed to this work. It's a lot of different people, a lot of different working groups, and especially want to thank the students in my lab who have worked tirelessly on these projects. So that's what I've got for you.
Thank you, Danielle. I hope you can see our
I
room.
saw clapping, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, the clapping doesn't do well on microphone, but it was not silent clapping. Thank you so much. Okay, let's see. I'm going to start with questions from the room and then see what we have online. Any questions from our participants?
Hey, Danielle, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I had sort of a general clinical question. When you have a person like the person you showed a video of early on in the talk that has a different degree of functional impairment in their 2 or more languages, which one do you think should be treated? Should it treat the language that is worse off or the language where they have less impairment? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so to kind of rephrase your question there, which direction might you see greater generalization?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's really difficult to say in terms of severity. So for one, we don't actually know, even from that example, that our patient there has different severity across languages. So understanding whether language control has been affected in their bilingual background, this is, this is part of the mix of understanding holistically where is this patient at this time in their recovery, what's affected, what's preserved. Assuming that that person had an imbalance, I can't really say whether things that have more difficulty or less difficulty in a language should be the target for treatment. My suggestion actually would be to target the things that are more similar across languages. And I have a suspicion that in cases where there's less cross-language generalization, it's because there's underlyingly more difference in the structure, more difference in the processing mechanism. So in either direction, because we have such an interacting system, trying to support things that are really similar across languages, we should see generalization in either direction for those similar structures.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The questions from our group here? Okay, I had put my question online, but it's more general than Sigmus's question, because Sigmus's question was actually specific. Mine was more in general and maybe with a different tone. So given the vast individual differences between bilingual speakers in proficiency of any of their languages, differences in aphasia types and symptoms, the languages that you're comparing, and then differences in personal goals by patients, right? Some people may want to go back to one of their two or multiple languages for different reasons. What do you think is actually the prospect of the development of a general assessment and treatment recommendations for speakers with bilingual aphasia or bilingual?
Do you mean like, where do we go from here? Because it's such a complex question.
Well, the question really is, do you really think it's possible to come up with general recommendations, right? Given all those.
Yeah. Well, I think, if we look at aphasia, it's actually a fairly complex problem, for people post-stroke. Which language domains are affected? Which individual features, structures are affected? What parts of their brain have been lesioned? What is their language, educational, life history background? So bilingualism, I would say, is similar in the complexity of the factors that we need to consider for an individual. And so, my background in both bilingualism and more recently, grammar deficits and aphasia, I don't see this as necessarily being more complex of a problem. I think it's really, we just have a lack of data. I think if more people were working at the problem and at scale, we would be able to answer the questions. Just to point out, 57 published articles since 1980 have included about one patient with bilingual aphasia, but over half of the population is bilingual. So I think it's just a matter of focus and trying to understand what the problem is.
Thank you. Okay, it looks as if that brings us to the end of your presentation. Danielle, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and please go out and support science.
All right, yes. March for science, everyone. Get out there.